He used to always insist that I wear a suit jacket when I come on the stage with him, but this is supposed to be the informal part of the discussion, so I rolled up my sleeves. I would like to pick up on one central point that Martin made about being able to have a conversation with robots, and then also, if I have the connection still in my head, make the link to Nicoletta's proposal about very large-scale annotation efforts in contraposition to Martin's view that it's pointless. If we're going to talk with robots, then they have to be able to speak to us in our language. And they're not just speaking n-grams from some translation engine, they're actually expressing in a language concepts that the robot has come up with themselves somehow. And it seems to me that in itself is a strong argument that we have to have linguistically informed grammars as part of this large collection. Now, you'll probably think me sort of a dinosaur for still going on about syntax and semantics, because those are supposed to be solved problems. Well, they aren't yet solved. They're a long way from being solved, and I think, as Martin reminds us, Zip warned us they're not ever going to be really solved. It's just we should keep working on that task. So my viewpoint in this large discussion maybe is a bit too narrowly focused on the challenges involved in constructing linguistically rich models of these 23 languages or more. We know something about that problem. We know that it takes many years to do a grammar of one language correctly. That correctly is a sort of an oxymoron, to do it reasonably well. There are several people in this room I can see who have devoted very many years of their lives to working on grammars of particular languages. There are people who are associated now with relatively more recent efforts that are quite successful to build comprehensive, good covering grammars of some of the languages in Europe. And I think the real challenge I'm interested in is how we make that process of grammar construction more efficient. That is, how do we extract the wisdom from linguists or help them build more wisdom and encode that in a kind of formal representation that computers can use, or robots in particular. And it seems to me that that challenge is mostly about how to construct an apprenticeship program. My experience, and I think that would be shared by others in this room, is that the most effective way to get a grammar built is to have somebody who has already worked on grammar construction pass on some of their expertise about how that's done to the next generation, and then have them do more of the work. Being in a room like this reminds me of one possible model, which is that we should perhaps try to establish a monastery/convent somewhere in Europe, where we would, possibly with the enticement of great pay, because that's the only tool we have these days, try to extract or lure some of the very best young aspiring computational linguists to take up residence in that monastery with some more senior grammarians who maybe don't live there but come to visit often, and work on the development of these 23 grammars in lockstep, in parallel, with the insight, the clever ideas from one grammar being able to be efficiently passed on to the next grammar, not by waiting for the next Elrec conference every 2 years, but actually walking across the hall or having a little symposium so the Romance language people could go huddle twice a day, and the Slavicists would be off in another corner somewhere. That notion of kind of a monastery convent scenario has some things to recommend it. Building a grammar is not something one does for 15 minutes a day now and again. It is, I think, inherently an obsession. Stefan Müller could probably confirm that view. He's been obsessed with German for a long time. Bertolt Christmann. I think of these two because they have recently also been working in this kind of apprenticeship mode, working on languages that I think they know very little about, or at least they used to know very little about. And I have recently had that experience with two colleagues, one working on a grammar of Bulgarian, about which I know absolutely not a word, and another working on Mandarin, about which I also know not a single thing. But we could quite efficiently, over a period of several weeks and months, build reasonably interesting grammars of those two languages. They encoded a lot of the information that is in the standard reference books about those languages. And we were able to link those tightly with other grammar efforts that are going on because we have been working on these other languages in parallel. The other issue I'm most concerned about with this notion of apprenticeship is that with very few exceptions, grammars in this world are one-person entities. They are one-person art forms. They are built, they live as long as that single person is interested in the problem, and they go onto a shelf as soon as that person's interest moves somewhere else. That's more or less catastrophic for building a reusable, sustainable resource, let alone 23 of them. I think we have to find a solution to that problem, and I don't have a very good one yet, about how to take the relatively arcane, often arbitrary decisions that a grammarian made in balancing these three pillars of efficiency and robustness and precision. Every grammarian is making trade-offs all of the time around those three pressure points, making some decisions about just leaving out some constructions that are too hard, or giving up on something that's too expensive to compute, or something they don't understand. Those decisions are embedded, often implicit in these grammars that we build, and the next grammarian who would pick up that resource, I'm going to kill this thing yet, who would pick up that resource and do something with it, has to somehow get inside the head of the previous grammarian. It would be nice if they could even be worked on in parallel, in collaboration. I haven't seen much success of that. So I'd be satisfied with some mechanism we design that would allow us to pass on that knowledge. So again, this notion of a semi-religious institution, an obsessive sort of institution, would be a way in which that might happen. And my goal there is not just to do linguistics. In fact, I think that's probably not the right place to do linguistics. You need rich interactions with other linguists to do that. It's to build resources which, at a minimum, could be used to serve Nicoletta's request that we try to semi-automate the annotation of very large parallel corpora. I agree that that's a very good goal, or a valuable goal in a number of ways. I don't yet think the technology exists to do the annotation semi-automatically for these 23 languages at the level of syntax, let alone semantics. Who knows about the rest, the harder things, the real things. And so I think one of the early steps toward that annotation task would be to build these grammars in parallel in a concentrated way. And I'm reckoning that would probably take 2, 3, 4 years. That's not something that can happen in 6 months. That would have to be a concerted effort. We'd have to have a kind of an Olympiad where we tried out, had lots of students or postdocs trying out for the position, because there are lots of crummy grammarians and very few really good gifted ones. It's a bit like the musician metaphor that Martin said. There are some people who are just good at it, and it only takes about 20 minutes to know whether they're going to be good at it or not, once you've seen them at work. We would have to try and elicit those and push out the grammarians who are going to waste our time. So we would have to have a small, serious crowd, and then set them off in that monastery convent someplace for a few years. Maybe feed them bread and gruel. And at the same time, be trying to figure out how to build the next generation of apprentices coming in 2, 3, 4 years down the road. And their goal would be to build that large annotated corpus. There would be a measurable outcome. There would be a degree of annotation of a certain level that could be specified, and we could then exploit those annotations from one language to the next to potentially bootstrap, build up a more efficient scheme. The net result would be a grammar that could be used for that annotation task, but that could also ideally put inside that robot that Martin's going to build. So that the same model that was used for that annotation is the model being used to construct novel sentences, new things that have never been said before by anyone or anything. And I think that bidirectionality is crucial. The resource has to be there. I do not think that can be learned from existing annotations. That's something we're going to have to invest human ingenuity into constructing to build those abstractions, these grammars that are exploited for both of those purposes. So then we just have to choose the city for the monastery, that's all.
So the final convent, the linguistic grammar convent?
Well, I'm as much against importing the sexual problems of the Roman Catholic Church into our field as I am against syntax. So please put condoms in the toilets, and I ask you a question. Is syntax useful? I have not yet seen in any of the applications that I've built that I needed. Actually, I come from a language where syntax does not really play a role, but morphology does. And so do many of the European languages, because syntax is not really an abstraction level above the surface, which is linked to meaning to us. I'm Icelandic. My language can say Peter loves Mary in any type of order. Doesn't matter. It will still be the same. As for English, I understand the principle that you have to say word 1, word 2, word 3. And that is understandable, so that you understand who is doing what to whom. But for me, in language technology, I can't see it.
I remember a very heated and enjoyable conversation on this very topic 3 years ago at a bar upstairs in Shanghai, organized again by Hans and some of his colleagues. And I think after 2 hours we had had a very pleasant amount of beer and conversation and came no closer to agreeing on this point. I can at least suggest to you one immediate application of where syntax, at least for the languages I have looked at, plays a central role, and that is in the task of language teaching, that is of grammar teaching to teach the next generation of humans how to appropriately exist in a society where the written medium is necessary and where not every sequence of words is legal or conveys the intended meaning. So we're currently working on a project at Stanford in the education program for gifted youth, somewhat misnamed in this case because we're actually working at, well, children are all gifted, of course, but these students we're working with are not gifted in their ability to write English. And we're using the grammar of English that I've been working on with colleagues for many years as a grammar checking device to help the student understand where they have made a mistake and give them very specific instruction on how to correct it. That could not be done with just morphology, could not be done with just pragmatics. It requires specific information about the language of syntax so that we know that you don't say in English, this is a too big room to meet in. That's not a possible thing to say. You have to say in English, this is too big a room to meet in, which is a very silly thing to have to say, contrasted with this is a big enough room to meet in, where you don't say this is big enough a room to meet in. So whether it's too big versus big enough changes the order with respect to the determiner. That's something the poor students just have to learn. They have to be taught it, and having an engine, a model of the language which is fine-grained enough to give them that kind of instruction is extremely useful. They get instruction in a very immediate way that they could not get from their teacher trying to herd a class of 40 students through this grammar exercise. So there are applications. I take issue with you. There are applications, maybe not ones you've worked on, where grammar is extremely important. And I think anyone who's tried to build a generation engine also finds that there is a lot more syntax than one first thinks. When you move beyond the simple surface word order of subject-verb-object, down inside of the dusty, knotty corners of syntax. And we need more beer, exactly, yeah.
One thing that you said brings up some very ancient memories for me. Way back when I had just finished my undergraduate work, I used to know a man called David Wheeler in the mathematics department at Cambridge, who amongst other things was, for example, the inventor of the subroutine. David Wheeler once said to me, one thing about computer programming is it's something that has to be done by one individual. Two individuals can never work together, let alone at separate times or in separate places on the same computer program. Now, this was a guy who knew more about computer programming than anybody you can shake a stick at. We have done things, lots of things in computer programming in exactly to overcome that problem. I think that's probably what object-oriented programming is all about. Maybe there are some things along those lines that need to be done in grammar engineering to make that more easily done on a collaborative basis.
I completely agree with that. Observing that the current state of the world is that there's one grammar per human, and that's the way it has always been, is not a model for the future. It is not sustainable. We have to find a way through to better cooperation among multiple individuals working on the same human resource, the same description of a language. Yeah.
When you spoke about the monastery, etc., just a memory. I remember maybe 30 years ago, I don't know when, the model that IBM, for example, was using to build the grammars for the grammar check and putting exactly a number of people in the same room, 10, 15, I don't know, to develop the various grammars that they needed. And there was this room where for more than 1 year, all these people were developing the grammars. But the model was the one person, one grammar in reality. The interaction was among the various languages, using more or less the same model, generic way. But it was the monastery.
Yeah.
In a sense.
Then a question when it comes to combining different methods for building and extending grammars. So right now there are several strands that are each successful in certain ways. One, and that has not been beaten by anything, is the rule-based, the intellectual work for some parts of the grammar. But then you have other disadvantages if you fully bank on this one. Then many people, among them some here present in the audience, have worked, and you yourself, worked on automatically extending grammars, especially on the lexical level, by corpus work. So putting in all this long tail there that the human grammar writer cannot do intellectually. And then there's a third strand that is very successful in probabilistic context-free grammar parsing and statistical dependency parsing, namely learning the whole thing from annotated tree banks. So these three lines. And this is one thing. So the question how to combine. Do we need all three, or just one, or just two of them? Or all three? And how could they, in your monastery vision, be combined or hooked up to more larger collective working? And then the second thing is, recently in machine translation, more in statistical machine translation, more people use parsing, but they cannot use any type of parsing. They have to use special types of parsing, or they cannot use any parser, are used to complement the statistical language processing. And usually it doesn't really matter whether these grammars, that's what the people tell me, for instance at Google, at other places, Philip Koen's group and so, who are working in this line of research, Chris Callison-Birch's group, it does not really matter whether the grammars are very accurate, but they have to be very good at exactly those things that statistical machine translation is not very good at. Namely, for instance, certain non-local dependencies that are very far apart from each other. And if they fail really on other things, then it's not really so very important, because very often they are used for filtering. They are choosing among different orderings and so on. So can you comment on these two things? The one thing is how the three things connect to each other, and then the second thing, is there really the one true grammar, or can there be grammars with different specializations, or would we really have one core grammar for one language that all these others can be derived from?
So let me, Mike, thanks. Let me try the first one, but I'll do both of those briefly, rather than giving them the justice they should have in the discussion, just maybe to raise some points. First, I'm by now quite convinced that the interaction between the manually constructed grammar and an annotated corpus should be an increasingly close one. And that what the grammarian should be doing in large part is building technology that can speed up the process, reduce the cost of annotation. So the grammar should present candidate structures, candidate annotations to a human so that they can efficiently, quickly arrive at what they believe to be the right annotation, probably often overcoming errors or mistakes in what the machine has provided. So something analogous to, I think, what was used in the Negra corpus construction, and that has been used in, I think, quite a few other efforts, even Don Hindel's parser being used to initiate the annotations in the Penn Tree Bank. This is a good strategy. The machine does a lot of boring stuff really well and does it fast. The farther up that food chain we can bring the grammar, the more the annotation is rich and correct and consistent, so that the human just has to do the few hard pieces. So I think those annotated corpora should be grammar-based to make for consistency and detail, but they don't have to be, the annotations can surmount, they can rise above whatever the grammar can do. As for the second question, I don't think there is going to be just one grammar, although I think there's probably just one repository of the best of the synthesized human knowledge about the linguistic properties of that language. But even when we're doing parsing and generation, we inevitably assign different settings for the grammar that we use in parsing and that we do in generation, in part just for simple, trivial things like formality. I want to be able to parse sentences like, I'm going to see you next week, where that's spelled G-O-N-N-A in most informal writing in email or SMSs, but I don't need to generate that sentence, we're going to be at a meeting tomorrow. If I'm generating a formal letter to my boss, then I don't want to spell G-O-N-N-A. I want to spell it with going to, the received way that that's done in formal language. That means there is a minimally lexical choice, but often even constructional choices I'm making depending on what I'm trying to communicate and who I'm talking to. So I think the notion of, that's just a trivial case of, there's a notion of a kind of layered set of constraints in the grammar about the kind of work it's trying to do. Being, if it's parsing, it's trying to be relatively accepting. If it's generating, it's probably going to be somewhat more restrictive. And for particular tasks, like for this grammar checking task, I can throw out huge parts of the lexicon and large parts of the grammar that are simply not relevant for a third grader trying to learn how to write relative clauses. It's just not necessary. There's big chunks of the language, that are simply not relevant. So I think for any kind of application of NLP resources, there's going to be this kind of layering. I think that's part of the interesting puzzle, to figure out how to build that modularity, that layering into these manually built resources.
All right. So thank you very much, Dan Flickinger.
Thank you.